I'm going to talk about Semiocide. So we've been hearing with the last few presentations sort of like a bottom-up approach to semiosis, biosemiotics, and reality. And I'm going to argue that we have a bottom-up and a top-down problem when we destroy our environments, right? So this notion of semiocide, I'm taking from genocide, ecocide, and Ivar, as I'll talk about. And I've given some talks about this yet. We had a special issue on the biosemiotics of waste that some of you contributed to. And semiocide is actually the question that haunts our time. Maybe you've heard about the Metacrisis or the polycrisis or the crisis of crises. Or it's this looping effect that's occurring when our systems become destabilized in one way or another. Because when we think that these populations are expendable or that part of the earth is expendable, we end up on a finite planet coming to constraints. And even in 1906, Max Weber, the grandfather of sociology, wrote, "Democracy is predicated on a robust middle class." And so far, we have done this in a way that requires colonization because we have not redistributed. We have not taken a Rawlsian approach. And so if we're going to continue having this artificial stability of the centers at the expenses of the peripheries, we need new continents. But he said, and this was in 1906, there is no new continent at our disposal. So we have tried to mine other realms. We've tried to have water futures and assets in other ways. We have the Bretton Woods Agreement during World War II, which said, okay, we need to stop fighting each other. Let's fight the earth instead. And that's exactly what happened. So what happens when we reduce complex living systems to mere numbers and metrics? This is a question central to biosemiotics because we're dealing with an intangible. We're dealing with, you could say, the dark matter of meaning. And I'm reminded of Goodhart's Law, which Cory Doctorow often writes about. And he said, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And why could that be? Why could that be? When we have a measure, right, like we want to optimize on this metric, optimize on that, what happens in human systems? Or you could say in any living system, when it becomes a target, you're excising all other metrics, and you're making this one the one ring to rule them all. You get what Adam Smith called the rentier state. You get grifters. You get people who give you a simulacra of the thing that you're supposed to be measuring. You get what Donald Trump's doing right now with statistics on unemployment and the economy. You get what our stock market's doing. You get people who make shit up. And so this is a big problem when it comes to global systems and planetary consequences. As H.L. Mencken once wrote, for every complex system, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And so look what we've done with turning our measures into targets. For climate change, all we care about is CO2 measurements. And what are you going to do? You're going to do geoengineering. Forget about planting trees. We'll just make machines that suck this stuff out of the air and never mind about the thermodynamics of it. We'll just go to Iceland where, we have free geothermal energy. And great, we have the biggest system in the world. And this thing, as my friend David Ho, the climate scientist, says, it's a time machine that brings us back 3 seconds. Now, of course, the amount of materials it took to create that thing, to transport it all over the earth, consumed at least 3 seconds in a year of CO2. But we see the same thing with biodiversity loss. Instead of just protecting areas and not letting them be logged or farmed for soya or beef, or realizing that maybe that's not the best diet for the Anthropocene, instead we do bean counting. How many species are in this given plot over time? Oh, there's less now. And we've done science, and we've sort of made the world a better place, even as they go down every year. Human well-being. We have economic indicators, right? You can have all the money in the world, but if you've got a chronic disease, if you've got mental health, forget about it. Education, same thing with test scores, especially in the US, but also increasingly around the world. You see people with turning metrics into targets, and then the entire education is how to game that test that's going to be definitive for your future. And all of these forms are forms of semiocide because they are creating a habitat for people that takes away all the meaning and all of life. So semiocide, the systematic destruction of meaning-making processes and relationships, a term coined by Ivar Pura, the geologist, paleontologist, and chair of the theoretical biology section of the Estonian Society of Natural Researchers, and biosemiotician who worked at the University of Tartu for many years, defined semiocide as when signs and stories that are significant for someone, and this could be in any species someone, are destroyed because of someone else's malevolence or carelessness, thereby stealing a part of the former's identity. Right? If we take seriously this notion of semiotic scaffolding or cued representation, mind in life, that we have an external, ecological, extended, embedded, embodied mind, you take those things that we map onto away, and our references, our ability to know ourselves, our ability to think and feel and to situate ourselves is attenuated. So expanding upon Raphael Lemkin's coining of the term genocide in 1943, and environmental lawyer Polly Higgins' coining of the term ecocide, semiocide fills a much needed gap. According to Pura, semiocide has two modes: accidental, through ignorance and lack of direct intent. That is, you could say, in an ecology, you have different molds, and one mold just takes over the entire ecology of the other and changes the pH, and the other molds are not able to survive and reproduce. So their Umwelt has been changed, pH changes, and the other molds die off, and you get a monoculture. And because you have a monoculture before long, that one is probably also going to die off. And then there's malevolent, with deliberate harmful intent, which, as far as I can tell, we are the only species that has deliberate harmful intent, malevolent ecocide. This has been formalized by Fatia, where we see with semiocide, you have unpremeditated with biotic and inadvertent types, and then premeditated, which is negatory and celebratory. I'll let you figure out what this means. Yay, we killed them, our enemies. Yay, we chopped down all of their olive trees. But we see that, there are different forms of doing this. I'm going to focus on the human varieties. So my hypothesis, and hopefully it's generalizable, is that semiocide results from perverse, oversimplified heuristics. When an organism has a fixed aim and is unable to select wider, and it becomes fixated on one notion of survival or defining success, it can instrumentalize its Umwelt to the detriment of other organisms, conspecific and interspecific. And I also argue that ultimately this is self-undermining. And that, I think, is the most important aspect, because a lot of my work has been thinking about how do we get elites, billionaires and etc., to understand that their idea of going to Mars or of excluding themselves from the shared destiny of humanity, as Bruno Latour talks about, is in fact a completely half-baked idea. They have not thought this one through. They had bad philosophy professors. They need to go, get some education. So Such colonization of the Umwelt, taking after Habermas's phrase, the colonization of the life world argument, occurs because it misunderstands the reliance it has on other organisms and aspects of its habit, which it discounts. So you could easily put this in an economic discount rate, right? You know, when we talk about the future and future persons, this has to do with serially discounting our scaffolding and our dependencies, right? As Alistair McIntyre wrote in his great book, Dependent Rational Animals, of which we are one. And in my abstract, I spoke of Semiocide, right? Semiocide is the custom of abandoning or killing the elderly once they've reached the age of, say, 60 or 70 traditionally. Different cultures have practiced it in different ways. Over time in Japan, it is known as obasute. Oba is like grandmother. And it literally translates to mean abandoning an old woman, usually by carrying her up to a desolate mountain and leaving her there. And this was usually practiced in Japan historically when there was not enough food, when there was a famine. And the idea is when people cease to be productive for that society, then you have to abandon the elderly and you know, just put them out to pasture. The Inuit likewise abandon elders on ice floes. This is sort of like a modernized version of what that would look like. If you are aging in Australia and financially vulnerable, while you might not be dumped on an ice floe, you are at risk of being abandoned. And this is from a women's, elderly women's website called Women Going Places. This image, which I really liked, because it's indicative of the types of activity that happen when we have this, I would argue, capitalist-driven embrace of the isolated individual family and person, where our elderly are farmed out to hospice or old folks' homes, where our kids are farmed out to schools, which were created in the first place to be factories so that they could be good factory workers, right? So there's a farming out of all unproductive members of our society as either getting the training to be productive in the way that we define as productive, or when they're no longer capable of that in this very narrow sense, then they are useless, and hence we don't really care what happens to them. And I find this to be aberrant, you know, not something that historically human beings have done in terms of our long history, our animistic history, as Joshua Schrei talks about when he says animism is normative consciousness in the history of Homo. And instead, I think that it's an indication of poverty in a culture and a lack of connection, a lack of ability to understand that the role of elderly are extremely important in the nurturing of the young. If you see orcas, orcas have grandmothers present in the pod. They have intergenerational babysitting, right? And so, you know, grandmothers who live to be 80, 90 years old, who teach the young while the mama goes out and gets the food. So we can think of this perhaps in terms of niche differentiation. All organisms make niches and are made by their environments, and by sharing, there's abundance for all. Acknowledging the limits to one's niche keeps populations and egos in check. Thomas More, in Utopia, the 1500 book, talks about what happens when your society gets too full. Then you go colonize another. And this is something that, of course, also happens in the animal world, the plant world. When it gets too dense, you spread. But how do you spread? I think that's the interesting question. And if we look at indigenous peoples who have, in some circumstances, managed to control their population, so they didn't need to consume all the resources in a given locality, this is a very interesting data point for us to learn from. So familiarity with niche and reliability help create niche entrenchment and speciation. So contrary to what Darwin said, where at the edges of our society, you get the most speciation, because that's the liminal phase, Kropotkin, Peter Kropotkin, the Russian evolutionary biologist, prince, who was sent off to Siberia because they didn't know what to do with him. He actually found in his study of deer and moose, etc., that you got the most diversity within a given species in the center, where there was the most abundance, where there was the sort of perfect setting, right? Where you could experiment and play without having too much cost, where it wasn't too costly to do that. And, this is very interesting because our sensory pharmacopoeia, which I'm going to suggest that we evolve via semiotic channel synesthesia, basically. So it's our internal symbionts, our external symbionts, our microbiome, of course, and there's multi-level selection happening at all times, right? And this is not just, our five senses, but it goes far beyond that. And I particularly like the sense of smell, right? So as people age, their sensoria are rewired and remapped, often to compensate for changes and losses. Our senses often compensate for each other and substitute. They sort of, Nora, I think, uses the term cover for each other. Our senses cover for each other in interesting ways. And as the ebb and flow of perception leans on other senses as a crutch for our sort of totality of meaning making, which we as human beings have a unified experience of most of the time. Sometimes it's not unified, but that's normal. The relation between senses creates a sort of synesthesia, which normally when everything is working, we're not even fully aware of. This is the Heidegger's hammer that we heard in the previous presentation from Don and also from Rebecca as well. The absentia, which we talked about. Now, we know that things aren't mapped equally. Some of us are more visual, some of us are more auditory, some of us are more kinesthetic. All organisms require certain sensory stimuli in order to develop their capacities. Without a familiar world to press up against, some capabilities are stunted or lost. When we map on our heuristics to a particular environment over time, we encode our anticipatory networks into and onto the environment. And when our environment changes too fast, when we're displaced from the home that we grew up in, the home that we raised our children in, the home where we know all the smells and the contours of the counter and where the faucet is and how much pressure it takes to open the door, and when we move into an old folks' home because we can't pay our rent or our kids don't want to deal with us anymore or whatever, we lose our mappings and hence our sense of self. And this, too, is a form of semiocide. So this maps on quite well to Ryan Eisler's notion of domination versus partnership systems. In the domination system of configuration, we see rigid hierarchies. We heard rigidity in Jagmer's presentation, what happens when cell structures get too rigid. We see rankings, like Val Plumwood says, are asymmetrical. These are pernicious dualisms. And we have what Lakoff calls the stern father archetype, right? Where violence and domination are normalized. And I would say that this is indicative also of semiocide, because it's a sort of single direction. It's not bidirectional. On the other hand, we have, on the other end of the spectrum, you could say, we have partnership societies. The partnership system where instead of having hierarchies of domination, we have hierarchies of actualization. So who's actually best at getting this thing done? And we do that, but that role doesn't essentialize you, doesn't make you set for life. in a particular position, that we are diverse beings with diverse identities, and thus there's no essentialization of place in society based on any given attribute. So for Eisler, this is key, the ranking versus linking. Since instead of ranking superior and inferior, we have hierarchies of actualization of power with and power to. So instead of the question of who's on top, dominate or be dominated, we see the quality of our connections. And this is, I think, a very interesting way to look at possibilities of recovering our sense making. So command and control systems reduce the Umwelt of others, as Fabian Scheidler in The Age of the Mega Machine has shown. Reductionist selection for success leads to impinging on others and never enough syndrome. One more yacht. The marginal gains, asymptotically for redundancy, end up undermining the entire semiotic system, harming those worst off in a Rawlsian sort of scenario, but also quickly destroying the entire nature cultural system. And as we can see with the destruction of thousand-year-old olive trees in Palestine, we see that ecocide is semiocide. Killing one's Umwelt kills the organism no matter the justification. And this is why climate change is such a real threat. If we change too fast, our fast system of thinking cannot catch up. And most organisms have cognitively offloaded even more than us onto their environment. My colleague, Marcus Wild, has written a book on plant cognition. He says fish may be even more sensitive to pain than we are, right? So we have it completely backwards with the natural world and thinking, oh, they don't, Kurt Cobain ironically singing, we can eat a fish because it don't have any feelings. They may be even more sensitive than we are to pain. So we see here a funny cartoon, right, where there's a funeral procession of all the animals that lost their Umwelt. They lost their forest when it was cut down. All organisms need conducive environments. Even viruses only flourish in acidic rather than alkaline bodies. Otherwise, they're just a crystal, right? When our Umwelten is different from what we know, or are different from what we know, we live in impoverished circumstances with stereotyped behavior like you find in zoos, zoo animals, rather than creativity, speciation, and so on. So ecocide and semiocide are a form of total planetary life devolution and dysbiosis. If we look at our holobiont, this also is indicative in dysbiosis versus eubiosis. But you can't just get a fecal transplant and think everything's going to be all right. You need to change the external world, your stressors in your society. You need to make sure that you are not worrying that somebody is going to resent your unequal wealth and come, kill your family or something, or shoot you down as CEO because you've denied the claim of their family member. There has to be more peace of mind because stress will lead to cortisol deterioration. So interspecies meaning making also means that semiocide is always interspecies. So that's a claim I'm making, that semiocide is always interspecies. From the bacteria to the holobiont to trophic cascades, when our environment is degraded, we lose meaning, and we aren't even aware of it much of the time, or certainly not to the extent that we would have been, because we have lost many of our symbionts that let us make more complex, nuanced meaning in the first place. So this is an Ouroboros sort of argument. And we can see, here on the left, Donella Meadows, 12 levers of change. On the right, we see the pyramid of public health intervention, right? So what has a smaller impact? All the stuff we're investing in. What has a larger impact? Changing the entire soup we're swimming in. And we can see this very clearly. Only 10% of overall health outcomes are attributable to products. Where's our money going? It's not going to socioeconomic factors or physical environment, a little bit to health behaviors. This is a scientific upside down reality. It's Alice in Wonderland that are all of our funding priorities. And so if we want to have meta sense making, understanding that our knowledge of the world is one model, which allows us to not overdetermine the veracity of our model, then we need instead epistemic humility and non-veridicality to allow for interspecies semiosis. So finding ahimsa modes of selection requires disarming defense mechanisms built on ignorance, so the work of agnotology and trauma. And just to sum up, as Elizabeth Sawin, a student of Donella Meadows, has written in her book Multisolving, we need to do the opposite of interspecies meaning destruction. We need to create interspecies meaning scaffolding through ecologies that support that. So where people pool expertise, funding, and political will to solve multiple problems with a single investment of time and money is an approach with great relevance in this area of complex interlinked social environmental challenges. Thank you. One or two quick questions, and then it's lunchtime. Yeah, Martin.
I just want to pick up on what you said about CO2, which I think deserves some semiotic attention as well. So to try to be really pointed, I think Cartesian recognition science has reached its logical endpoint in a way, because we now have the technical skills to split molecules, to deal with them. So it's possible for politicians and businesses, okay? CO2 is not a problem. We can split it into its components, rearrange it in order to parity. And then we end up with corporate fantasies like capture, and that big carbon capitalism is a real problem. These corporate fantasies. How can we frame this up?
How can we frame this sort of destruction? Is that what you're talking about? Like the logical conclusion? So there, yeah, good question. I think that first of all, the CO2 reductionism or essentialism is a big question that we have to confront. I don't think there's any way around it. Let's see if I can share this. I don't know if you can see it, but it's, yes, it's the greenwashing habitability zone that a colleague of mine put on LinkedIn. So it's like nobody believes that we're actually going to achieve a Dyson sphere or solar radiation management or nuclear fusion. We've been hearing this shit for 40 years. And hydro, wind, solar, geothermal, that's too cheap. So we have to focus, if we're going to lie to ourselves longer, because we're getting so tired of it, we have to look at direct air capture, small modular nuclear, new nuclear carbon offsets. So this is the greenwashing habitability zone where it actually makes sense for us to keep on lying to ourselves, because this is the plate spinning. You know, when you have a system that's so broken, then the only way to keep it going is by adding a new plate, because all the other plates are crashing on the ground. Yeah. One more question, super quick. I might not be able to answer it. Yeah.
I'm radical semiotic take time to understand that have their actual livable to them. Their idea that some main entity which might actually relate to the question of how do we semiotically see this stuff.
Wetico?
the capitalistic
Reductionist models.
and that's the monster of
The Wetiko, yeah. There's a lot of good work. Jack Forbes's book, Columbus and Other Cannibals. Yeah.
ethical psychosis being a sort of disorder which was identified in that is very similar to your definition of semiocide. Something that results from first by heuristic.
Yeah.
So the Wetiko sort of wants cannibal that treats other relationships as something that can't be disconnected from, simplified, objectified, and consumed without consequence, but of course, for living consequence. Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that into the space. Yeah, I've written on Wetiko, the hungry ghost, the Tao Tse in Chinese. So there's many cultures, same phenomena. So thank you very much. It's lunchtime.